If you go back and watch the first Indiana-Michigan game from earlier this month, you'll see a lot of this. 4 Michigan players around the perimeter, Xavier Simpson with the ball, and a 5-man ready to set a ball screen. Michigan has different ways to get into the spread ball screen formation, but once they were in it, Indiana didn't prove that they could stop it. Michigan scored at will in the first half, thanks to a combination of bad defense and some tough shots falling. But in the second half, Archie Miller chose not to adjust at halftime. He defended the spread ball screen the exact same way. It will be interesting to see if he makes any adjustments this time around. But with that being said, let's take a look at the scheme from game 1. First, let's focus on the player guarding the screener, in this case Clifton Moore. Moore is a seldom used reserve, but he shows a really good motor here. His job is to stay attached to his man. Johns is going to sprint into a ball screen here, so Moore sprints right with him to stay attached. The reason staying attached is so important is so that Moore can be early on his hedge. Moore is looking to get his feet pointed to the sideline and to force the ball handler to dribble away from the basket. The guy guarding the ball, who in this case is Green, is supposed to go over the defender screening but under his teammate hedging in order to get back safely to the handler. Here's another good example. Moore stays attached and is in great hedging position, not letting Poole get downhill. Juwan Morgan was the most common defender guarding the Michigan ball screener, and yet you'll notice he wasn't in those first 2 examples that I used for good execution. And that's because even though he scored 25 points in Ann Arbor, he gave most of those back with his defense. Both Moore and Evan Fitzner were more engaged and had much higher attention to detail in their hedges. Here, Morgan doesn't stay attached and is forced to lunge out on the hedge. Matthews could easily pick up a foul here on Morgan if he wanted to. On top of that, Romeo Langford tries to go over Morgan instead of under, which allows Matthews middle penetration. Again, Morgan doesn't have urgency to stay attached. If your ball screen coverage is to hedge, the ball handler should never be able to shoot from behind the screen. And to make matters worse, Morgan fouls on the shot. If you don't stay attached and are late on the hedge, it puts too much stress on the tag man who is guarding 2-on-1. Without the hedge to push the ball handler backwards, the tagger has to decide between the roller and his own man who is shaking up for a 3. Some credit for the Indiana big struggling to stay attached has to go to Michigan's scheme. This is their Chin series, which they ran a ton against IU. Morgan can't help on the back screen if he wants to stay attached. When Fitzner's at the 5, he does a good job of literally staying attached by touching the man he's guarding. On this play, Green's the tagger, and he can hold that tag longer because Simpson is just a career 29% three-point shooter. We've mostly been focusing on the man guarding the screener, but let's switch to the man guarding the ball. In this case, it's Romeo Langford, and as soon as he realizes a ball screen is coming, his job is to make the handler use the screen and send him into the hedge. But here, Matthews rejects the screen, and Indiana has no help built in to handle those situations. Again, this is a combination of bad defense and good offense. Michigan has plays built into their offense specifically meant to reject screens for baseline drives while distracting weak side help defenders with false motion. It's always hard to isolate the game plan from the execution of that game plan. In other words, was Indiana just bad at executing the hedge, or was the decision to hedge wrong in the first place? And the answer is probably a combination of the two, but I think there is some strong evidence to support changing the game plan this time around. Some of this is just my personal opinion, and I'm not really sure that Archie Miller will switch the coverage. Like I said before, at halftime of last game, he stuck with the hedge despite getting torched in the first half. And on the flip side, Indiana is a little healthier now, most notably with the return of Rob Finney. Yes, when Indiana was poor in their execution, Michigan picked them apart by taking advantage of the tagger and by rejecting screens. But even when Indiana did execute, the results weren't great. You hedge ball screens instead of switching ball screens so that you don't have mismatches guarding the ball. But the thing is, Michigan scored even when Indiana was regularly matched. This is a decent hedge from Fitzner, and McRoberts goes over-under just like he should, but he still can't guard the ball. Again, pretty good initial defense. We have a hedge and an over-under and a tag. But this time, Justin Smith can't guard the ball as he closes out after his tag. Here's a more simple example. Matthews sets a ball screen for Michigan, and I can see the logic to not switching here. You don't want McRoberts to have to guard Charles Matthews. But even though Smith does stay on Matthews, he has to help a little on the ball screen first. So even if he is a marginally better defender than McRoberts, that pretty much goes out the window because of the increased difficulty of the closeout, followed by having to guard Matthews. I would guess it's pretty unlikely that we'll see Indiana just completely start switching tonight. So this last concept that I'll talk about could be a little bit of a compromise, and that's called the emergency switch. That term means that you still try to perform your ball screen coverage, but if the big is late on the hedge or not attached, he yells out the switch as a last resort. Too often last game, Morgan would just be in no man's land instead of either hedging or emergency switching. But here is the one emergency switch example I could find. Teske has been great in Big Ten play, but you have to pick your poison when developing a defensive game plan, and I think this is what I would pick. I'd try to force Michigan to counter the switches by going into the post to Teske, and ideally use whoever is guarding Xavier Simpson as the primary helper on that post-up.